Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 61 of the PetroNerds podcast, and it is October 12th, 2022. It is a Wednesday, and I am joined today by a very special guest. It's a wonderful follow-up because last week we had Lou Pugliese, on my former employer, on the podcast talking about Washington, D.C. insider stuff and the Biden administration. And a perfect follow-up today is Diana Furchgott-Roth with the Heritage Foundation. And she is actually, I don't want to botch the title, you're the head of climate and the new climate energy division at the Heritage Foundation, correct?
Thank you so much for having me on, Trisha. Yes, I am the new director of the Center for Energy, Climate and Environment at the Heritage Foundation. This is a new center that was just set up a couple of months ago.
Awesome. Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. I knew that was new, and I was going to sort of botch the title. So, anyways, her role is sort of, all encompassing. It's a great title, and I think there's a lot that sort of umbrella that goes in. And we met a few weeks ago here in Denver and sort of talked about every topic related to energy under the sun. We probably can't cram that all into a podcast, but we're certainly going to try, because I like to cover a lot of ground. So I'm going to talk give people the timestamps for what's happening in the market, and then we'll sort of go through the things I want to discuss today, which is definitely the IMF came out yesterday, downgraded the global economy for sort of the third time. So talking about the state of the economy, what's going on in the market with oil and gas. We've seen massive volatility in oil prices in the last few days, and really would like to, given that you are in DC and the stuff that you're covering, really want to talk about some of the net zero EV stuff, stuff going on in the EU, but really want to get into Biden and Biden's response to the OPEC plus cuts, and really the sort of most recent rumors. You had an article that you quoted me in last week, which was awesome. And that was a Forbes article, and that we were talking about OPEC and the response to the cuts and what the Biden administration was doing. We also talked about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve release, but I think most recently is the talk about the ban of exports, or banning of U.S. exports, whether that's natural gas or whether that's oil. And I think there are a lot of implications for that. So those are some of the broad topics. But just to give folks a timestamp, it is Wednesday, October 12th, 2022. We are seeing a lot of volatility in oil prices. If you're looking at CNBC, you've probably seen an 85 handle on WTI. As of right now on Bloomberg, it's 87.13. We're looking at Brent 92.27. We've really come off. We've had these $5 swings since last week, and these OPEC cuts, sometimes more than $5 swings. Henry Hub is about 6.51 right now. Dutch TTF is hanging around this $44, $45 level on a dollars per MMBTU basis. The 30-year mortgage rate is 7.14%, and that's really, really high. So we're seeing a lot of bad data coming in on the housing side, basically just where people aren't buying and selling homes. That has massive implications. The reason I put that in here, massive implications for oil demand and what's going on in the market. We're seeing layoffs, obviously huge layoffs on the mortgage sector, and that correlates to the 10-year yield, which is we're seeing about 3.93%. So lots going on there. We may or may not touch into any of that, but I do think housing is always something I'd like to talk about. And certainly, housing in China are my two sort of things I like to throw into the podcast. But I think we should start with, I'd like to start with sort of, we'll just start with the biggest thing in the room, which is the Biden administration, the response to the OPEC plus cuts, and really this uncertainty. I think a lot of U.S. allies are sort of having on, the Biden administration was pretty clear that, hey, we're going to export more natural gas, so we're going to do these things to help Europe. But this talk, Bloomberg put out an article saying, quote, Biden is walking a tightrope as the world clamors for U.S. oil and gas. And this talks about, potential, banning of exports of not just oil, but of potentially diesel or gasoline. And we export, as of July, we are exporting a significant amount of oil. As of July, we were exporting 3.8 million barrels a day of oil and 1.5 million barrels a day of diesel. So this does have pretty big implications. And I'd love to know what your thoughts are on that. I don't know if that's, you personally, Heritage as well, and just in general, sort of the DC insider, what's going on there. So thank you so much, and have at it.
Well, it's great to be with you, Trisha. Thank you so much for inviting me on your very influential podcast. And here at Heritage, and I have been writing about this for many, many years, we are all in favor of using our resources. And the United States holds over 373 billion barrels of recoverable crude oil. reserves, which is over a 50-year supply. And we have almost 3,000 trillion cubic feet of technically recoverable natural gas, which is a 100-year supply. And we need to be using that. We need to be getting it out of the ground. And it gives a disincentive to companies if we ban exports. What we need to be doing is increasing our LNG terminals, making it easier to export, making it easier to have pipelines in place, increasing permitting for drilling, increasing permitting for approving these pipelines so that we can help our allies in Europe and we can help Americans here who rely on the energy business for their jobs. And it is really depressing to see President Biden going cup in hand to Venezuela, which is allied with Russia and China, and cup in hand to Saudi Arabia, and asking them to produce more when we have these reserves right here at home. And of course, the impetus for what President Biden wants to do is climate change, global warming. He wants to reduce emissions. But if these emissions are created in Saudi Arabia or in Venezuela, I mean, they're just as bad for global warming as if these these reserves of oil and gas are got out of the ground here in the United States. In fact, it's better to get them out of the ground here in the United States because we have stricter regulations as to how to actually produce them. So this is just a lose-lose. It's a lose for the environment, it's a lose for the American people, and it's a third lose for Europe that doesn't have the benefit of our supplies. Lose, lose, lose.
Right. So, which is very different than what China always says is win, win, win. But if you hold on, I want to dig a little deeper because I think, a lot of folks on, whether they're in the field or they're an executive of folks that, across the board or in and outside oil and gas that listen to this podcast. I think it's the, talking about, so what is driving this, right, from the Biden administration? It seems very, when we look at energy policy out of this administration, it is very anti-oil and gas. They would say, people call it fossil fuels, which I do not, because it has a pretty negative connotation. But it's
well,
really
and also, Trisha, they don't come from fossils.
right.
They do not come from fossils. Fossils do not make these fuels.
They do not. And so I think the clarification though on what's sort of happening, you're an economist by training, you have a very impressive and extensive background. And so none of this is sort of new to you in what's going on with the market. But in terms of what's going on in Washington and what potentially the White House is reacting. Obviously, we have midterms coming up in then just the next couple weeks. So there does seem to be a very clear desperation on the administration's part to get oil prices down, to get gas prices down. He may not get what he wants because, as he should know, but over the course of this year, there's a couple week lag with refineries. So when prices spiked, and then it's going to be a couple week lag. So he may not get this. The market's sort of doing it for him right now because of real recessionary fears, which I would like to get into. But right now, I mean, if the Biden administration is thinking about or sort of mulling these concepts of banning exports, whether it's gasoline, certain volumes of gasoline, certain volumes of diesel, and again, if we're exporting under 1 million barrels a day of gasoline, 1.5 million barrels a day of diesel, and a whopping, I mean, I know the EIA didn't update the numbers for propane, which is a little bit frustrating. But the end of last year, we were exporting 1.5 million barrels a day of propane, which is just huge. I mean, Chris Wright talks about it in his ESG report as his favorite hydrocarbon. Absolutely one of my favorite hydrocarbons as well, because it's so easily transportable, has massive impacts on what we can do in Africa and Asia, and not just reducing emissions, but just bringing heat to people's homes so they can heat their homes, but they can also cook. But we're exporting 2.2 million barrels per day of hydrocarbon gas liquids, which is largely NGLs, which obviously includes a big chunk of propane. So these volumes are really significant and have a meaningful impact to the global market. And it's something that I think is really hard for this administration probably is because nobody actually says how much we produce. And you hear people on CNBC and Bloomberg and everywhere on the market, BBC, you hear them say, Saudi Arabia and Russia and the largest oil producers in the world. Then the U.S. is the largest oil producer in the world, the largest natural gas producer in the world. So we're producing 11.8 million barrels per day now. That production has climbed, is climbing back from, the COVID lows. It's about 1 million barrels a day off the high of 2019, but we are clawing our way back, and we're producing at all-time highs of natural gas. About gross withdrawals is nearing 120 billion cubic feet per day. So it's huge volumes and has a really big impact on the global market. So I just think one, the global impact. I mean, there are many from a price standpoint, from a dislocation standpoint, but it seems to be potentially a very knee-jerk reaction to say, hey, well, we'll cool prices in the U.S. And yes, you may cool prices in the U.S., but your ramifications are going to be huge. It seems that your foreign counterparts are going to be very angry, and the fact that you're asking Saudi Arabia and sort of almost begging them to increase output, angry when they say they're going to do a cut. And I'm not defending Saudi Arabia and getting in bed with Russia and the whole China thing. I'm not defending that, but I'm just saying this is it's a global oil market. And we've never had control of what Saudi Arabia can produce. So I think the Biden administration was probably a little bit naive in thinking they could do that. The Trump administration did have a much easier to pick up the phone and talk to the Saudis and the Russians and sort of push them on those things, and that is beneficial to some degrees when you're trying to have these conversations. But this administration, one, has not had that relationship and is sort of desperate to say, hey, we're not going to produce it here. We're going to enact all these climate change executive orders at home. We want to focus on, we'll get it from somewhere else and we'll deal with demand later. And the problem is demand's never addressed. And that's really where the CO2 emissions thing would come from. And, I think it's all for naught. I don't think we're really impacting CO2 emissions. But the point is, they don't admit that we produce all this stuff, but they sort of have to, in a way, admit it now if they're saying we're going to ban our exports, which means we're we're not only domestic, but a global hydrocarbon powerhouse. And that has really significant, meaningful impacts. But I would love to know from where you're sitting, your background as an economist and all your, you have a very impressive resume. And also what's going on, in DC now. How are you thinking about this? And, how folks are viewing this and maybe how this has come about?
Well, we just had a session here at Heritage, which you can find on our website, called The Politics of Climate Change. And in the session, we were saying that a lot of what President Biden is doing and wants to do is contrary to his economic interest. I mean, President Biden could lower the price of oil and gasoline right away by standing up and saying that he is going to approve permits faster. He's going to allow drilling in all those places he said he wasn't
Absolutely.
before. He's going to allow offshore drilling. He's going to speed up permitting of pipelines. He's not going to give the SEC and FERC permission to delay projects because of potential climate risks. I mean, if he had another policy, prices would go down right away because of future expectations. He's not doing that. Why? It's because the environmentalists are so strong in his coalition as part of his government. And it's really sad because there's the blues and the greens, the blue collar workers who've traditionally voted Democrat. Then there's the greens, the environmentalists. And in the past, they've kind of had a truce. But about 10 years ago, that truce started to fall apart. I think when Keystone XL was under discussion, because all the blues would get jobs from Keystone XL pipeline by helping build the pipeline and also by refining what comes out of that pipeline in our refineries. So there's a big chasm within the Democrat Party. And that is why President Biden is acting as he is. He's giving in to the Greens rather than listening to the blues that want lower prices, lower gasoline prices, and more jobs. This is not a rational economic decision. And the price of oil cannot, in the long term, be lower in the United States than the rest of the world because prices are set in global markets. And there'll always be some runaround. These cartels do not work in the long term. And it's very short-sighted of President Biden to be even proposing that. But things get really strange when these midterm elections approach.
Absolutely.
It's a referendum on his presidency. And plus, there's the real possibility of losing not just the House of Representatives, which I think is already gone, but also control of the Senate.
So that may bring up a good point in terms of, I think a lot of folks probably outside of Washington don't appreciate that obviously these aren't sensible policies. They are sort of, midterm pushes. And this really, we have seen over the course of the Biden administration, a very, hell bent on the green policy, aggressive green policy agendas, which I have a lot of issues with. And sort of the European template tells us everything not to do. And that seems to be everything that Biden is doing. And so it does seem to be that these very hard left green, and I don't mean left in that sense, but these aggressive green policies and those running those seem to be what's driving, steering the ship for the Biden administration, which is really tricky, I guess, when it comes into, both foreign policy and domestic policy, domestic energy security, domestic economics, but also foreign policy when we're talking about Russia, when we're talking about China. It gets really, really tricky in terms of how you sort of implement this. And so I'd imagine there's some issues within the White House of people of disagreements on what folks should do, because we've never sort of had we've never sort of had a Democratic president that was this anti-oil, domestic oil and gas, and had these sort of issues that we could always sort of rise above if it was a major issue and do this. So it seems that that's being lost right now in sort of desperation for midterms. And then it seems, what's going to happen after midterms? I mean, are we going to be just going back to this aggressive, yes, the climate change executive order, I think in the beginning of this administration, there were just a series of things, canceling Keystone XL, the climate change executive order, rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, and a number of other executive orders, delaying permits for 2 months on federal lands, or stopping permits for 2 months on federal lands. Now you can't re-up an existing permit that doesn't exist anymore on federal lands, and no federal lease sales. So there's a number of things domestically, and I think you are beyond 100% right that people really don't appreciate. If you can impact oil prices when OPEC can say we're going to cut 2 million barrels a day, but they haven't actually cut anything, and they can increase oil prices $5 to $7 given price swings, the Biden administration has the ability to do the exact same thing. So if he really wanted to change the midterms, and that's the thing, I think to your point of, does he lose all these, I'm curious, how many of these hard, crazy green voters are there? Because it seems like if we're catering to them, he could lower prices immediately by saying, hey, we're going to improve Keystone XL, and we're going to accelerate permits, and we're going to open up lease sales. Prices would probably drop $5. We could probably see, if he did it this afternoon, we could probably see, a 7 handle on oil prices, and give that 2 weeks. That would blend into refineries. By the time people are going to the polls, they may see, healthy 3 figures on the gasoline prices. So I'm curious, is that what's happening? I mean, is that the calculation, and that's changed from historical? I mean, so I'm curious, that continuity in the White House, is there, what are people saying about this in DC? And what do you sort of expect after the midterms?
Well, these are great questions, Trisha, and I'm not privy to the discussions inside the White House. If I were in the White House, I would say that he should be going all out to produce what we have available. And I think we also have to ask, what would a sensible policy look like? If we're concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, what we are doing to lower emissions here in the United States is a drop in the bucket. Meanwhile, we're letting China continue to run its coal-fired power plants and expand these coal-fired power plants until 2030. What we need is more nuclear power, more dense, emissions-free energy. Nuclear power is the perfect solution. So if we were thinking about this in a rational manner, and we were concerned about these emissions, we would put in place as much nuclear as we could, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. We would put in place these small nuclear modular reactors that could help people in developing countries, in emerging economies, reduce their use of wood and coal, and would enable them to get to the next level in terms of water to their homes, electricity to their homes, which would have ramifications in terms of health. These are all things that Democrats are supposed to be in favor of. They say they're in favor of raising up lower income individuals to new economic heights. But no one is talking about doing that. They're just talking about reducing emissions here in the United States, letting China go ahead with its coal-fired power plants until 2030. And then afterwards, and they're not even talking about other sources of energy such as nuclear, because it just stretches reality to believe that solar and wind are going to be able to produce all the electricity that we need for these so-called 100% sales of battery electric vehicles in 2035. Now, after the midterms, the House is likely to have a Republican majority. We're likely to see more oversight hearings. Kathy McMorris Rodgers is likely to be chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. She has said that she is going to hold hearings, oversight hearings. The Senate chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee if the Senate goes Republican, would be Senator Cruz, who also wants to hold hearings. Congress also has the power to send President Biden budgets that pull back on some of this infrastructure funds that were in the infrastructure bill, and also the green climate funds that were in the Inflation Reduction Act. So those are things to watch coming up in the future. Congress would have more power. Of course, with the system of checks and balances, President Biden could always veto these bills, but you would imagine that there would be some give and take in this. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens after these elections and how the power changes.
Those are excellent points, and I really appreciate that. And if I was looking away, that was not because I wasn't paying attention. That was because I was trying to grab some data points on China. So you explained a lot. You clarified. I very much agree with most of that, and I think that I don't think probably a lot of listeners are on the same page in terms of understanding that obviously if you were really trying to reduce CO2 emissions, you would do it through producing at home. You wouldn't be doing through transporting. And U.S. production of oil and gas is only 1% of U.S. CO2 emissions. So it really is a sort of all for naught type of thing. And I think there's obviously with these aggressive green policies, it seems to be way more than just about CO2 emissions. And you can sort of throw
Right, right. And
everything in
Tricia, if I could just say one more point about offshoring manufacturing. The
Yep.
tougher the rules are here, the more we offshore manufacturing to other countries such as China, where the regulations, as I mentioned before, are not as stringent. So we would actually be increasing global emissions by increasing manufacturing in China. So we need to look at emissions as a global problem, not just a US problem.
Right. And I think that's why I have such a massive issue with the Biden administration and these and green policies in the name of CO2, because I don't believe them that they're doing anything to impact CO2. And so
Right.
I think this is a great point to sort of pivot, and number of things we can dive into in what you said, but this is a great point to pivot into sort of the global piece. I want to get into China, I want to get into Russia, and I'd like to get into the EU and energy security and sort of where that sits right now. But when it comes to China, and listeners know, I absolutely love to talk about China, and I think it's extremely underrepresented in terms of just a reality check and how the market is even understand it. We're hearing obviously the a lot of stuff going on in the chip space. The Biden administration, I disagree with much of their policies, but I have to say the stuff coming out on restriction of chips, I'm very much in favor of. And clearly, there is some serious aggression on that's going to have an impact on the Chinese, the ability to access, semiconductors and not just produce them, process them, et cetera. So that's happening right now. That's going to have an impact on the chip side. Some of this is sort of working out because we are having a backsliding in the economy, which we need to talk about as well as the global economy. Is that 6 months ago you couldn't get this stuff, but the problem is now, if you're looking for a gaming computer, you can probably get it. And if you're listening to NVIDIA or AMD or these companies, yes, they're being impacted potentially by these chip regulations, but they're also being impacted because demand is slowing down, and global demand is slowing down because the global economy is slowing down. And so there's a number of things going on there, but I do think the China thing by this administration and by Europe has to be really, really appreciated. We're just starting to see a lot of stuff coming out of Europe mentioning China. We just have seen the UK say that China, they're now labeling China as a threat as opposed to they're reterming the relationship with China and saying China is more of a strategic threat than a competitor. I think that's very, very serious in terms of the language. We've seen the UK and the US, Jake Sullivan and others come out in tandem saying talking about the China threat. And on the energy space, I really do think that's important because when we look at the UK, UK has tied up their nuclear facility, the Hinkley Point facility, that the Chinese they're not doing it yet, but they'll potentially be building it. And so there's a big question mark on what's going to happen there. The Chinese are involved in that. And so it's really serious. And then you see the Netherlands, if you just look at trade between various EU countries and China, it's very, very strong, including in the Netherlands. And you look at exports of solar panels in the first half of 2022. So we're talking about, during the war in Ukraine, as Europe has supposedly, tried to push themselves off of natural gas from Russia, which they didn't do an amazing job with. I mean, they did. They reduced their imports from Russia. More so, Russia has reduced their exports to them. And then they're getting, but the bulk of the money, the bulk of the revenue, Russia's still getting because or Europe has not reduced their imports of oil. And they've massively increased their imports of solar panels from China, which largely come from the province of Xinjiang, which largely come from coal-fired power generation, and most importantly, come from forced labor in 1 to 3 million Uyghur Muslims in some form of internment and forced labor camps. And that's just something that is it's really, really important for folks to think about how intertwined and tied up all this stuff is. And it's also really important, you make a very good point about, China's coal-fired power generation. And the reason that is so relevant is that, everyone in this country, including Colorado, is really killing themselves. These utility companies are to reduce their emissions and to get rid of our coal-fired power generation, which is an extremely from an energy security standpoint, it's very scary. Not just from a coal production. I mean, you don't even have to. I always say you don't even have to have it. You just use it every day. But the ability to have it to be able to turn the lights on when you need it. And for China, there's a lot of data coming out, a lot of little snippets and data points coming out in China. One, I've said this on a number of occasions, but they've increased their coal output by 100 million tons in just 5 years. So they're all-time highs. And they, if you look at the power generation, if you look at the BP statistical data, and this is the case from, I tell this to folks a lot, if you're looking at an IEA forecast for coal demand, you're going to be wrong. So almost every business in the world is probably going to have this wrong in terms of where coal's going to be. And China they're ramping up their coal-fired power generation as of actually recently in the last couple of weeks. They have released new plans to actually ramp it up even further. So we're going to see in 2025, 2026 heightened levels to where we already see of coal-fired power generation, which is really saying a lot about what's going on in China. And we already have about 5,000 terawatt hours of power generation from coal now in China. And you had 1,000 terawatt hour increase just year over year from 2020 to 2021 for coal-fired power generation in China. That's massive. That's more than the entire U.S. coal-fired power generation. So I absolutely do think it's ridiculous when you're putting people out of jobs and you're shutting down coal mines and you're shutting down power plants and you are, shoving, wind and solar in particular into the grid, especially if you're buying those from China. You're shoving them into the grid and you're increasing the cost of electricity for the U.S. consumer, decreasing the reliability and having a very, very small impact, on CO2 emissions. Pollution is an issue, and there's lots of things that we need to talk about there. And I'm not saying this can't be done responsibly, but it's a very, very serious in terms of energy security. And there's a country that benefits, highly from this, and that is China. When we're sort of all killing ourselves to go in one direction, we're buying the solar panels from them, and they're ramping up their coal usage. And it's and there's a lot of stuff going on within China that is probably, potentially very aggressive, especially with Taiwan, and things on that front. And that's sort of a whole separate podcast. But that piece of this is not something, energy policy in China, is not something being addressed. I don't see by any, global entity, especially Europe, but we're certainly not hearing it by the U.S. administration either.
Right. Well, that's really true. And it's especially surprising because now Europe has found the downside of depending on Russia for natural gas. One would think that reasonable people would look at the potential dependence of the United States on China for wind, solar, and batteries for these required electric vehicles. 7 out of the top 10 solar panel manufacturers are in China. 7 of the top 10 wind turbine manufacturers are in China. And with 100% battery electric vehicles being sold after 2035, as California has mandated and President Biden has set the goal of doing, we will be even more dependent on China. So yes, we are planning on building batteries here, but everybody knows that this will make the vehicles a lot more expensive. Then there's the minerals that go into the batteries. China has vast control over a lot of these minerals. So we're sacrificing energy independence for a country that uses slave labor in Xinjiang to produce all these materials. One would think that people who are in favor of human rights would be jumping up and down saying we don't want to do that, but they are not doing so, which is very surprising to me. They should be doing so. So it's not just that we're not giving Americans jobs. We're dependent on China, a regime that has been consistently against its ethnic minorities, whether it's Uyghurs in Xinjiang, whether it's Tibetans, whether it's how they treat Hong Kong. It's universal. And we don't know, we know what they think about Taiwan, that Taiwan is part of China. And based on past events, We don't know what's going to happen to Taiwan, although the fact that President Biden has said he's going to um, protect it is, of course, very positive. But it's not just the economics, it's the geopolitics of this,
Right.
Trisha, that are so important.
Right. And I think you sort of summarized that really well. And I sort of think about this in a few when I'm trying to get whether I'm talking to clients or companies or various business to think about. It's sort of three buckets. It's sort of the the China, Russia, and the EU, and the U.S. over here. And the reason it's so important to think about how they're interconnected is because these policies have lasting and long term impacts. So the very aggressive green policies that Europe has put them in a situation where they haven't really changed their consumption. Very similar to what we've been talking about with the Biden administration, where consumption hasn't changed, but where you're getting the product is where the U.S. has been looking over the course of this administration, has been looking to lift sanctions on Iran, has been looking for Saudi to increase barrels, doesn't want to approve Keystone XL, doesn't want to get it from Canada or the U.S., but is looking to get increased production from elsewhere. And it's always a fallacy to say, well, you can't ramp up production in the U.S. Well, it doesn't, then you can't ramp in the speed of which you ramp up production. Same goes for everywhere else. So there's a little bit of BS there. But the point is that in Europe, Europe consumes about 55 billion cubic feet per day of gas. And I say these numbers because we always hear percentages from Russia. And I think it's very important to just put some numbers and forget the percentages for a moment. Is that 55 BCF a day of consumption, 20 BCF a day of production. So you have a massive gap between production and consumption of gas in Europe. And so you've had consumption basically flatline over the course of the past 10 years, and production has just declined massively because countries in Europe have prioritized these green policies and are producing a lot less. And then they've just continue to get more and more imports from Russia. And they get about the pipeline capacity, it was about 16 BCF a day in total piped into Europe. Now, that's a lot to offset. It's massive. And so it gave Russia a significant amount of leverage. And the reason they got the leverage is because the need that Europe obviously had for this natural gas. And it is lower. I mean, a lot of people don't realize is that why it was so important for Europe is that, they maintain their consumption. They were also able to reduce CO2 emissions because natural gas benefits that immensely. So they get it from Russia. They don't have to produce it. Everything sort of looks good. And then Russia has the best of both worlds because, the U.S., we produce more than double what Russia does for natural gas. But Russia, it's not a big export revenue, right? They don't make their money from natural gas. They make it from oil. And so they've had a drop in barely a dent in terms of their revenue over the course of this war on gas, and they've decided, hey, we're shutting off the pipelines. People can say what they want on who sabotaged Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, which hasn't even flowed, being sabotaged. But I believe it's the Russians doing that. And that's a statement to Europe saying, hey, you may have thought we're going to turn these pipes back on in a couple of years, but actually we're not. And that says to me a lot about the long-term game of what Russia's doing and a lot about actually that interconnects with China. And it's sort of hard for people to see this, but I try to walk them through Europe and then we get to Russia and sort of the interlinking to China. But so Russia's, getting their revenue from oil. That has not changed yet. Europe has continued to take those oil volumes, both via tanker and via pipeline. And so Russia has that leverage where I get the revenues from this. You need it. They don't really need the revenue from natural gas as much as they do from oil. And they're able to have the maximum amount of leverage in terms of power on Europe. And so they put Europe into, full throttle head first into a recession where countries all this winter are just going to be devastated in terms of being able to keep heating their homes and keeping the lights on. And this is already having an impact on businesses. This does impact the US when we think about companies on the Dow Jones Industrial, on the S&P 500 that are exposed to Europe. It's actually pretty huge. So when you think of another leg lower on earnings, another leg lower in terms of stocks in the US, I think it has a lot of room to come down. I'm very much with Jamie Dimon on that because we're not seeing the full impacts of everything going on in Europe. So they're going to have to curtail all this. And then the piece of the Russia-China piece, which is really important, is that, Russia's been able to do maintain this war in Ukraine. People can talk about how well it's going, everything going on in Ukraine, but it seems to be more of a one beginning chess move to me than actually sort of pulling out your rooks and knights and going after queens. It seems to be these initial pawn moves because they're keeping it long. They're basically, making it clear to the market that they're not intending to curtail this this war. And China-Russia trade has just gone through a roof. Pre-war in Ukraine, all the way till now, has really accelerated. And Russia's largest trading partner is China. China has benefited massively from purchasing, reduced, coal imports and oil imports, and natural gas imports to China from Russia have increased by a third. They're actually taking additional volumes of natural gas that they're not using in China, and they're exporting into Europe. So they're probably getting LNG. China is exporting LNG from Russia probably to Europe, which is just crazyville in terms of all this. And so the China element is really huge because they've been emphasizing food and energy security. They have this, they have these policies of dual circulation, a number of things going on in China that really folds into why they would want this sort of closeness with Russia. They have stalled everything within the UN when it comes to this stuff, and so it's very precarious situation that we're very focused on Russia right now. We're not focused on China in terms of their involvement in this war, their funding in this war. What's the long game for them? Especially when it comes to energy, as well as how they're looking at Taiwan. They've already taken over Hong Kong, so there's a lot there. But I would. And I know that's a lot to throw at you, but I would sort of love from the sort of EU standpoint and Russian standpoint, and we can tag in China, but I'd love to sort of get your feedback and thoughts on that, and how you personally are thinking about it, and just, anything you want to have at it.
Sure. Well, one thing that I'm thinking of is the increased pressures in the EU for fracking and natural gas development there. Because don't forget, Trisha, and you know these numbers much better than I do, Europe also has natural gas. So we've had Prime Minister Liz Truss, who said that fracking is on the table in the United Kingdom. We've had Chancellor Scholz, who's opened the possibility of fracking in Germany. There's other countries that are undoubtedly looking at it themselves. And when you're facing a very cold winter and you're facing manufacturing companies that have to close down, you start looking at these options. And you might also look at the United States and see that our air has got successively cleaner every single year, that we are not increasing emissions because of natural gas. We're reducing emissions, and we're doing pretty well. Millions of people want to come here every year, and they're taking another look at their resources, and we should be encouraging them to do that with technology, and enable themselves to stand on their own 2 feet with regard to their own energy production. Plus, they have a lot of ability to be ramping up nuclear production. France has reduced it, but don't forget, France used to get 70% of its electricity from nuclear, didn't have any accidents. No one walked around France saying, I'm scared that there's going to be some explosion from a nuclear power plant. They managed to get rid of their nuclear waste. And these are all examples that the developing world can follow. Plus, emerging markets could follow them also, emerging economies. They have the ability to frack too. They have the ability to use these nuclear modular reactors that will power small communities and can just be taken out and replaced with other ones when they are spent. So we have a lot of potential for clean energy development all across the globe, which will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And people who are concerned about these emissions should be encouraging these kinds of developments. And it's surprising that people in Europe, there's pressures you can see right now, but it would be good to see Europe come to some of these solutions. Now, if we're talking about the environmental, social, and governance initiatives that, again, are worldwide, we have situations where the World Bank is not allowed to lend for nuclear. Now the World Bank is apparently allowed to lend for natural gas, but coal-fired projects, no, even though these could result in cleaner coal-fired generation than is the case now in Africa and Asia. Banks are being pressured not to lend for oil, natural gas, and coal. And this lack of capital is impeding these projects that would be beneficial in terms of getting people higher incomes, making them better off, and also reducing global emissions.
Those are fantastic points, and I wanted to take this in a couple ways, but we're going to have to just keep going with this because you make some really, really excellent points, especially on the banking side. So one question, this is sort of a two-parter. The first is that so I get a lot of questions from folks and people on the podcast that I've had, and folks that I work with, is that, okay, well, we hear that what's going on within Europe. We know that there, potentially, obviously, with midterms in the U.S., there could be a shift, that we get some more sensible policymaking, or at least a check on sort of the White House from trying to do things that we probably will see some more positive things in the U.S. on an energy front, right? Potentially interest in building, a natural gas pipeline out of the Marcellus, which could really help for exports, et cetera. But in Europe, people always ask, so, well, is it happening? And I say, regardless of whether they admit to it or not, you do have a lot of sort of feckless leadership, I think, in Europe. There's a lot of weakness. I don't hear very positive things about Olaf Scholz in terms of how he's viewed, how how the country views him. He just doesn't seem like a strong leader. So I don't think he can do very much. But regardless of what they say on the green policies and on CO2, they are turning on, or Germany is ramping up coal, and they're turning on mothballed facilities, to my knowledge. So we increasingly hear of more of nuclear facilities that were going to be phased out are not being phased out. So it's sort of happening. There is an issue, though, in terms of this gets into sort of the banking and money piece, but there's an issue in terms of the LNG, right? They want US LNG, but they're not signing long-term contracts for LNG. And that's really, really problematic, is that you can't say, and this is why the whole breaking down the numbers of what they get from Russia and the whole pipeline and everybody's long-term agendas, you can't solve the immediate problem without the long-term solutions. But nobody wants to do the long-term because they want to go green. And there has to be the come to Jesus moment of, you have to sign these long-term contracts with the US so that these companies can FID the projects, and this can all go, you have to finance this stuff. And no one wants to finance this stuff because they've got this massive ESG pressure. They've still got Janet Yellen and everybody talking about climate on the SEC, and this sort of trickles down. And I think it's really, really important to point out, you mentioned the banking side, and it's so important to appreciate, the role of banking. So the first question, I guess, is that I would like you to address is sort of, are we going to have this sort of come to Jesus moment? In the US midterms, we may see a shift where we have some more rational policy making. Is that sort of happening regardless in Europe? I mean, we're seeing what the EU commissioners have said in these recent statements about both Russia and China, which I think is very, very positive, an acknowledgement of this. But you have to make these policies, and it just seems, if you're not signing long-term LNG contracts, that's a problem. And the banking piece, I think, is really, really big. I think, we mentioned, when we were talking offline about the World Benchmarking Alliance and these big entities that are really trying to pull, and have successfully pulled, billions of dollars of money out of what they call the fossil fuel hydrocarbon industry, out of coal, oil, and gas, and everything. So it's not funded. And so it's a big problem when your International Energy Agency out of Paris is citing all these numbers, when everybody in Europe is going along with it. And your major entities and financial hubs in London and New York are all feeding into this and pushing the ESG narrative, and it pulls funding out of this. And so it's very, very important to appreciate, I think, where the SEC is on this, where banks are on this, where regulators, and how people view sort of this whole ESG movement and the impact it's having on energy security, and geopolitics. It just seems to be massive. And I know that's a lot of things I threw at you, but the two big things are sort of what the rational policy making in Europe, and are we seeing it, and could we see that continue to go forward? And two is the role of banks, and funding in ESG, and how you're thinking about that.
Well, I think that we are seeing political pressures in Europe to develop their own resources, and they might not want to sign long-term contracts with us. But if they develop their own resources, that will create jobs, that will make them more energy independent. And I think that come February, which is one of the coldest months in Europe, I've lived in Europe for many years, I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on these politicians to at least allow development in some areas. We have seen the benefits of this development. We can see the Marcellus Shale is being developed on the Pennsylvania side of the New York-Pennsylvania border. It's not being developed on the New York side. We can see the growth in income in Pennsylvania rather than New York State. We can see how New York State, upstate, is lagging behind Pennsylvania. So, I mean, we have real data on the benefits that energy development can bring. And in terms of ESG, in terms of the capital requirements, there's going to be a lot more oversight hearings, because the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, by looking at climate risk for companies, is clearly going outside its mission. It's supposed to be looking at financial risk for companies. It's not supposed to be looking at climate risk. The same with the federal Energy Regulatory Commission that says it's going to be looking at risks of climate. These agencies are all going outside their mission. Office of the
Right.
Control of the Currency is another one. Federal Trade Commission. During the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, all these agencies were putting in offices of minority inclusion in their as part of their decision-making process. Now they're putting in climate change offices, and it's just very, very dangerous. It's very dangerous because if they were really to have a sensible climate change policy, it would be, as we said before, more nuclear, more natural gas. Instead, they're using this as an excuse to do more of what they did in the pandemic, which was close down entire industries. I mean, why was, for example, Home Depot open, but not Bloomingdale's, when Bloomingdale's routinely is less crowded than Home Depot? Why should I have to buy a birthday present for my daughter at Home Depot who doesn't really want a garden hose, rather than at Bloomingdale's where she might like a nice purse? They're using these, and people say they might be declaring a climate emergency, enabling them basically to shut down certain kinds of operations here in the United States. And we need to be looking very carefully at this potential abuse of power. Because once you've declared an emergency for one thing and you've seen how people react, you can also do it for something else. And it's very dangerous, all these new climate offices that are being created in all the different agencies. Because if the president says, well, now we have a climate emergency, just like he said, now we have a public health emergency, that would give these agencies excuses to do all kinds of things that really they should not be allowed to do by following the law.
Right. And I think the economic impacts to a lot of that is massive. I do believe from the very beginning of this administration, and I'm not talking, completely willy nilly. This is from very good sources. I mean, I think there was an intention from the very beginning of day one of this administration of how can they get away with declaring it a climate emergency. And the reason why is because that once you are able to do that, once you can make it an international issue, you can start regulating things on a much deeper front than you could by just saying, putting a climate change executive order. And they were able to throw a lot in that, but they had a lot of legal pushback. I mean, obviously the Supreme Court has pushed back on the EPA in terms of how they're impacting coal fired power generation, and that's pretty significant, and a whole nother podcast in itself. But I think under
Right. And also, by the way, they pushed back on the vaccine mandate.
yes,
The
they did.
Supreme Court pushed back on the vaccine mandate, and they've pushed back on other kinds of things related to the pandemic, powers that the United States government just took for itself.
Right.
And the Supreme Court, these went all the way to the Supreme Court. The problem is that you have to have some group with standing in order to be able to challenge them. And how you get that standing is complicated. You have to prove that you've actually been hurt. But I'm sure there are a lot of very competent legal minds working on that now.
Right. And I think that it's so important for folks to think from I think a bipartisan standpoint. It's not about, vaccines, or it's more about it's the power, right? It's when you have legal precedent and you start with this power. So and the
Right.
reason it's important is because, under the Obama administration, they did curtail. I remember this being, no one paid attention to it, but I thought it was a very big deal when we weren't going to fund India. We weren't going to allow the Export Import Bank to give money to India for
Mhm.
anything to buy. They wanted to buy backhoes and stuff made in the US, but it was for coal extraction. And so we said, the Obama administration said, no, it's for coal, so we're not going to do that, even though it produced jobs and stuff in the US. So it was sort of a statement of, the direction they were going. And then these climate change policies, and, they're very much umbrella policies. So these aggressive green policies, which we've seen in Europe, obviously having a very damning impact into Europe, but we've seen it in China as well. And I harp on that because China is able to sort of throw everything underneath it and say, this is in the name of, climate, we're doing this. And obviously they're not really doing it because of all the aggressive coal that they're producing for an energy security, but they're able to sort of throw a lot of stuff into it, right? They've had they impacting even just how folks are goat herders are in Tibet, the ability, because they can say, hey, this is damaging the ground, this is damaging the environment, so they restrict those goat herders, and they try to put these people into facilities and things like that. So they're able to sort of use it in lots of ways, and I'm not saying the U.S. is doing that, but the point is that when you have these broad blanket brushstroke policies, they have lasting and damaging consequences. And that brings me to the point of, I think, talking about the economy. And I think we should close with that because the administration, not only, and the reason I keep bringing up the administration is we're ahead of midterms, so the impact is huge, but the Biden administration has an energy problem, and they also have a major economy problem. So the global economy is slowing down. I mean, part of why we're seeing oil prices down is not just, it's because of these massive recession fears, right? And worries. We also have a very strong dollar because of the Fed raising rates, and so that has an inverse relationship. But the state of the global economy, the IMF has this is the third, third ratcheting down of global economic forecasts. I have, been on this for over a year, explaining to all of my clients, when you reduce GDP is very gross domestic product is very highly correlated to oil demand. When GDP and economic growth slows in the world, oil demand is going to slow as well. That's just a
Mhm.
reality. That's why it's important. But separate from that, just the state of the economy, they have a problem because there's a tight labor market that's sort of tight everywhere around the globe because of a lot of fiscal lags and a lot of pandemic era restrictions, and folks just quitting jobs, not incentivized to go back to work. There's a lot going on in that front, that we haven't seen that, and that's really really hard because we have inflation, and inflation has in itself helped pull down the U.S. economy for sure. I know folks don't want to admit that, but that's why you have to cool inflate. Inflation can trigger a recession because prices are too high, and so for the bottom 50% of America, inflation is a very, very serious. I mean, it's serious for all of us when you're trying to buy bacon and it's $16 for a pack of 12 pieces of bacon. But it's a serious for everyone whose most of their paycheck is going to food and fuel. And it's massive because that they just have no discretionary income. And we're seeing that when it comes from Walmart to Target to anywhere else. I mean, you're looking at inventory levels across the board for companies. And the reason why, the S&P 500 and all the stocks are down is because as the Fed raises rates, it's not just about the Fed raising rates, but it's that people can't buy this discretionary stuff. And so these pie in the sky evaluations don't hold up. And it's really serious in terms of what the US economy looks like. And so, and I think Janet Yellen just had an interview that was on CNBC yesterday, and she talked about Fed independence and them doing their own thing. But a lot of folks are pretty concerned about this jacking up, raising rates, and cooling off the economy. And I think it's inevitability. They have to raise rates because they let inflation get out of control. It's over 8%. And sticky inflation is very problematic for the health of the economy. And so as they're raising rates, unemployment's going to have to go up. And it's one of those things that's really, really hard. I mean, it's not something this administration has to deal with midterms because we're not seeing that rise in unemployment. But all the wage increases that folks have had in the bottom half of America have been completely and more than eroded by inflation. And it's such a serious thing for folks to realize is that, we have an unprecedented geopolitical, economic, energy, and wartime era situation. So it's why all these policies sort of matter that much more. But I'm very dialed into the state of the housing market in the U.S. and everything going on, and all of them have there's nothing positive, especially from an oil demand standpoint. And I don't think oil demand is going to crash and prices are going to crash, but I think it's going to be more like a 2008, 2009, which we had a financial crisis and oil demand sort of actually held up okay. But it's not looking good. And there's a number of COVID, the zero COVID policies in China that are impacting that. However, but just in the U.S. alone, I think the economy is a lot weaker than it looks on the face of it. And I do think the administration knows that as well.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, Trisha. It's possible that third quarter is going to come in positive, and that fourth quarter is going to come in positive because of Christmas spending. But the first half of 2023 doesn't look very good. That's because as inflation rises, people have less expenditures, fewer expenditures for discretionary goods. They're paying their gas bill. They see that eggs are over $4 a dozen, that milk is over $4 a gallon. I mean, this $4 number just seems to be through everything. Gasoline for your car is about $4 a gallon, when all these used to be two something
Yep.
beforehand. And then they say, well, maybe I'm just going to postpone purchasing this refrigerator, this stove. I don't need that new coat. I don't need to go out to eat. And then because of that, these other businesses get squeezed. And the Fed has said that it's going to raise interest rates another 1.25% in 2022, and is going to continue the increases in 2023. It's forecasting that unemployment will reach 4.3% at its peak. I think that's very, very optimistic. In
It
other
is
words,
very,
you cannot
it's
get
not realistic at
inflation.
all.
Yeah, you can't get inflation out of the economy with unemployment, the unemployment rate only at 4.3%. I see it going to something beginning with a 5 or 6.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
it's going to be really difficult. And the Fed has always been optimistic in its projections, by the way.
A-
So
Absolutely.
yeah. I'm very concerned about the economy going into the future, going into 2023.
And I don't think there hasn't been a whole lot of the. I mean, I think Janet Yellen should be kind of just. I don't think anybody should be listening to her anymore when she said only months ago that, before that, inflation was transitory and that we weren't in a recession, and that when the IMF clearly states, the International Monetary Fund clearly states that 2 consecutive quarters are a recession. I mean, everybody seems to redefine that term in politics, and especially this administration has, that we're not in a recession. Technically, the U.S. had entered into a recession with 2 consecutive quarters of slower economic growth for GDP. And it doesn't really matter in terms of, I mean, that's the problem, is people look at employment and they say, hey, well, it's healthy. It's really, really tight. And I would say it's not healthy. I mean, your point of, I think almost every economist that is worth their salt, the woman she's now with KPMG, the chief economist with KPMG, fantastic. And she's been calling for north of 5% for a long time, that if you're to control inflation, you have to have that go up. And so I think the Fed is trying to not talk about employment too much, because they know that that's obviously negative. The White House certainly doesn't want to talk about that, but you always see it from the top, right? You see it in if you look at 2007, we were seeing the same things, lots of volatility in the market. And I've had a lot of people on this podcast, even just a year ago, that said, oh, these expectations, it takes years for this to come to fruition and you can't time it. All this has been in the works for several months. We've had this in the works
Right.
for basically 2 years.
Yeah.
We've known a recession's coming. So it's all sort of been sort of teed up. But this unemployment piece, you always see it. So in the mortgage side, we're already seeing it. We're seeing in the banking side, we're seeing companies like Intel, Microsoft, Apple, you name all these tech companies are freezing hiring and saying they're going to start laying off. You're seeing Facebook or Meta cut these areas, and these are all sort of the fluffy parts, right? It's the metaverse
Right.
that they're cutting on. You're seeing Tesla, the same thing. All these, the autonomous driving vehicles, all this stuff that's sort of, not super tangible right now. It's all discretionary, and we think about discretion at home for the chocolate cake maybe instead of the bacon and eggs that we need, and that's the same for businesses. If it's discretionary
Right.
and they know that the consumer is not going to buy it. Apple just said that they're reducing, recently said that they're reducing the production of the iPhone 14 because they don't think that the consumer is going to buy it, because it's this higher discretionary item. So these all have big, large consequences for, U.S. unemployment is going to have to rise. And that's
Right.
going to impact, that is really important for, I think, businesses to understand, not just all the stuff going on in geopolitics, which are huge, but for oil demand. And that's where it gets really messy, I think, in terms of oil and gas, because the geopolitical piece, which we have not had, we didn't even have this in the 1970s, right? We had the Arab oil embargo and everything, but I don't think you could say we've historically had a time like this where we have very intense geopolitical risk, and also a very, very slowing and sluggish economy that's going south at the same time. So it puts oil in a very sort of unique position of where it's going, and it's something that people have to think about very carefully, in terms of how they're thinking about where prognostication of oil prices. But I'm I think we can close with that. But I'd love to know, do you have thoughts on that? Do you have how are you guys thinking about oil prices in that context?
Well, we definitely think this is a self-inflicted wound. If President Biden wants, he can lower oil prices by producing more. But in terms of the economy, if any of your listeners are thinking of changing jobs or getting a new job, now's the time to do it, because it's going to be a lot harder to do in 2023. That's what I tell all my young friends who are looking for jobs.
And I tell them not to change jobs. I think changing jobs right now, switching a horse in the middle of the race. If you're looking for, I mean, I think I understand where you're coming from in that, but I would say don't change your job, because if you have a good job and you have an employer who you think's going to be around, keep it, because I think there's something to be said about loyalty, and sticking through things. So if you're switching jobs, if you're a new employee, your odds of getting let go, as a recession hits, I think are pretty high. Whereas if you've been there a little bit longer, so and things get a little bit messy. But I think also that's really, really important to think about in terms of
Yeah,
housing, in terms of the ability to sell your house and everything like that. So
right. That's
yes,
true.
sticking with your job and having all these things and financial stability, all
Yeah.
very important. Very
But
much how we.
Trisha, there are these
Go ahead.
graduates, there are these people who are graduating from school, and they don't want to, they should not be sitting around looking for a job. If they get offered one, they should take it.
100%. Yes, we're
Yeah.
absolutely 100%. And we may have to have a separate podcast just with you, just on talking housing and jobs and economics.
Right.
But you have been an absolute pleasure, a wealth of information. Really, really appreciate you coming on the podcast, Diana. You have you recently just took up the post with Heritage, but you've been published a number of times. You just published the article within Forbes that you posted on LinkedIn. I reposted that. So you're sort of a wealth of information and treasure trove of knowledge, and an excellent economist. So I'm sure people can follow what you're doing on the Heritage website.
Yes, they can. And my personal website is dianafr.com. That's
Awesome.
www.dianafr.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And we will definitely have you back on the podcast very soon. Talk to you soon, folks.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much, Trisha.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.